let me start with this. Many of us are familiar with the notion of the deficit perspective. The deficit perspective, of course, is when, for instance, a teacher approaches a group of students based on assumptions about those students' weaknesses rather than the assumptions about the students' strengths. And so we've developed like this whole sort of vocabulary around challenging the deficit perspective in education. You know, all students are gifted and talented. All students can learn. That sort of thing, which is pushing back against the deficit perspective. But like every perspective, the deficit perspective has an underlying ideology that puts more of a sort of social context around that perspective. And for the deficit perspective, that bigger context is deficit ideology. Deficit ideology is, in essence, is kind of a worldview that explains outcome inequalities, like for instance, the quote-unquote achievement gap in schools, as resulting from supposed moral, intellectual, or cultural deficiencies within disenfranchised communities and individuals, right? So we talk about the achievement gap and the sort of schoolhouse chatter that happens around the achievement gap, where, when who is blamed for the achievement gap, right? So the notion that the achievement gap is largely the result of parents who just don't care about their kids' education. That would be a classic example of deficit ideology, and I'll talk about why in just a second. Think about a bigger issue. Think about poverty as even a bigger issue, and the notion that poor people are poor because they are lazy. Right? Again, that would be an example of deficit ideology. It takes some kind of inequality and explains it based on perceived or assumed deficiencies within the group at the bottom of a hierarchy. Another example would be, for instance, the glass ceiling, and people making the argument that, well, women just aren't very good leaders. Another classic example of deficit ideology. Another sort of example of deficit ideology, another way to think about it, would be that deficit ideology is kind of a worldview that where these bigger social conditions are completely ignored and dismissed, right? So we don't think about, for instance, the issue of poverty. We don't think about poverty. If we're going to make the argument that poverty is due to the laziness of poor people, then the question is, what are the different social dimensions that we have to ignore in order to make that argument? For instance, we have to ignore the lack of living wage work in the US. In fact, we even would have to ignore something like the unequal access to education, that low-income people are sent disproportionately to schools that are less funded, where they have less experienced teachers, where they're under-resourced and those sorts of things. Take, for instance, another example, the racial achievement gap. If we argue that the achievement gap exists because some parents say families of color just don't care very much about education, we have to ignore all kinds of social conditions, again, about what kinds of schools different people are sent to, lifetimes of racism we have to ignore in order to buy into deficit ideology. I would argue, just being around these conversations about education, I would argue that deficit ideology drives a lot of these conversations in education today, even among people who are pretty well-intentioned and pretty committed to equity or diversity or multiculturalism or even social justice. So the question is why? Why do people buy into this? I think one of the reasons that people buy into it is that deficit ideology draws on the stereotypes that already are embedded in the mainstream psyche. So for instance, the stereotype that poor people are lazy or that poor people don't care about education. The fact is that in the US, people, for the most part, already believe in those stereotypes.